Hello, everyone. I'm Casey. Today I want to tell you about Margaret Thompson, a woman who not only struggled with the perceived poverty her children attributed to her, but also fought to protect the last remaining shred of her faith. Now, let's step into Margaret's world and hear her story. After Kyle's mocking laughter died down on that glittering Christmas night in North Carolina, the world seemed to freeze over. Even though the fireplace in my small home on the outskirts of Charlotte was crackling, I felt a deep, biting chill in my bones. I came home and immediately turned the deadbolt. I didn't just lock it once. I turned all 3 locks, one after the other. Each click felt like a heavy stone being placed on a wall I was building around my heart. I was done. No more offers of help that were really just insults. And no more fake attempts to connect from the family I once considered my entire world. The silence of my house was my only companion until this morning when the doorbell shattered it. I looked through the glass and saw my granddaughter, Emma. She stood there in her little winter coat, holding a box of cookies she had decorated herself. Her voice came through the door, high and sweet, calling for her grandma. I stood perfectly still, my breathing becoming heavy and ragged. I could feel my hand trembling over the handle. A part of me wanted to pull her inside, to feel her small arms and smell that sweet scent of her hair. But then, Kyle's voice started playing in my head like a broken record. I could hear him telling everyone not to expect anything from me because I had nothing to give them. Those words stung worse than the winter wind. I felt the shadows of the hallway swallow me as I stepped back. My voice sounded thin and hoarse when I finally spoke, telling her I was too busy and to just leave the box on the mat. When her footsteps faded, I sank into my old recliner. The house was unnervingly quiet. There wasn't a single family photo left on the tables. I had turned them all face down or tucked them away last week. I told myself I was safe from the contempt and the pity Brenna gave me every time I picked up my knitting needles. I whispered to the empty room that they all just wanted something from me. That trust I used to give away like sunshine was gone, replaced by cold ashes. I realized I would rather live in this lonely fortress than let them trample on my dignity one more time. I slowly reached out my hand and touched the Outstanding Teacher of 2015 award, which had been sitting forgotten in a dusty corner of my bookshelf. The rough grain of the oak felt familiar under my fingertips, a small physical reminder of a life that felt so far away now. For 30 years, I believed that if I gave every ounce of love and sacrifice I had, my children would naturally be there for me. But the reality of my life, as a woman in her late 60s in North Carolina, has been a cold wake-up call. The recent education budget cuts last year had forced me into an early retirement I never wanted, leaving me feeling like my voice and my value had been stripped away overnight. I remember so clearly when my daughter, Brenna, was preparing to leave for college in New York. At that time, the economy was shaking, and inflation was eating through everything we had saved. My 401k was shrinking, and I was terrified for her future. To make sure she could walk into that new world with her head held high, I worked double shifts until my back ached and my eyes burned. I even did the unthinkable. I sold my engagement ring. It was the very last thing I had left from my late husband, a piece of my heart. I lied to Brina, telling her I just didn't like wearing jewelry anymore, so she wouldn't feel the weight of my sacrifice. I thought that kind of quiet love would build a foundation of gratitude, but I was wrong. It only taught her that everything I had belonged to her. The true pain, the kind that leaves a scar you can't see, started this past Christmas dinner. My son-in-law, Kyle, sat there in a $500 cashmere sweater that I knew was bought on credit he couldn't afford. He looked at me with such contempt as I sat there knitting sample pieces for the online craft course I was trying to build. He laughed, a loud, jagged sound that filled the room, and asked if I really thought I could get rich with a few balls of yarn. He told me it was a waste of time, and casually suggested that maybe it was time for me to move into a senior community so someone could look after me, since I had nothing better to do. He said it like he was doing me a favor, but it was pure emotional abuse, meant to make me feel small and useless. Brina, the girl I had sacrificed my whole life for, just sat there and stared at her plate of turkey. She didn't say a single word to defend me. In that quiet, terrible moment, I realized I was no longer a mother to them. To Kyle and Brina, I was just a bank that had run out of money. I was a burden that needed to be managed so they could eventually take control of this house and whatever social security checks I had left. Kyle's words were like daggers, cutting the final threads of my heart. I made a promise to myself that night, under the cold Christmas lights of Charlotte. I decided that I would never let anyone hurt me like that again. My silence and my wall of doubt aren't because I am a bitter woman. They are the shield I use to protect the few broken pieces of my dignity that I have left. After that Christmas night vow of independence, I began to weave a new rhythm into my life here in Charlotte, North Carolina. It is a quiet rhythm, one that no longer vibrates with the tension of arguments about money or the sharp edge of Kyle's sarcasm. There is a strange, heavy relief that settles over me every morning. I wake up, and I don't have to immediately check the weather of my daughter's mood to see if I am the beloved mother or just a financial burden today. I slip my feet into my comfortable Skechers and brew a cup of hazelnut coffee. I stand by the window, breathing in the scent of peace that I thought I had lost forever. But as the morning stretches on, the silence of the house begins to speak. It is a hollow sound that echoes from the empty rooms, a constant reminder that freedom can sometimes feel very cold. My afternoons usually disappear into the glow of my Kindle screen. I have the font size set as large as it will go, so my tired eyes can stay lost in historical novels without straining. To keep my budget tight during this era of skyrocketing inflation, I drive my old sedan to Target to buy small, single-serving meals. I no longer spend my days preparing the big, elaborate Sunday dinners I used to love. Instead, I spend hours clicking through Sudoku puzzles on my tablet, or letting the home renovation shows on HGTV fill the background. Not long ago, my neighbor Mrs. Gable stopped by to invite me to the knitting circle at the local church. I turned her down with a polite, practiced smile before she could even finish her sentence. I am too afraid that if I even crack the door to my heart a little bit, the betrayal of Kyle and Brina will rush back in like the fierce floods of Hurricane Helene. Last night, I found myself holding my phone, my thumb hovering over Brina's name for a long time. I could almost smell the sweet scent of the grandkids' hair, and I remembered how Emma used to beg me for just one more story before bed. A desperate hunger for connection rose up in my chest, urging me to just call her and ask if the kids had eaten dinner. But then, the image of Kyle mocking my modest hobby and my hidden assets flashed in my mind. Ooh, I shivered and put the phone back down on the counter as if it had burned me. I prepared a small piece of grilled salmon for myself and sat at the dining table. It is a table built for 4, but the other 3 chairs remain empty and still. As the pale North Carolina sunlight faded into the gray of evening, I just sat there in the dark. I felt the absolute safety of the fortress I have built for myself, but I also felt the crushing weight of its solitude. Watching Margaret at a table with 3 empty chairs, I wonder, is solitude better than family hurt? Must boundaries always mean total separation? We've all faced these tough choices, Have you ever felt this way? Please share your wisdom in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. For an entire week after that morning, I refused to open the door for Emma. My mind was never at peace. Every time the phone rang, or I heard the crunch of gravel as a car pulled into my driveway, my heart would tighten in my chest. I lived in a constant state of fear that it would be Brina, my own daughter, coming at me with more sharp words and accusations. Or, even worse, Kyle. I could almost hear Kyle's voice in my head, spinning another one of his grand investment schemes designed to hide the mountain of credit card debt they were drowning in, especially with how much the cost of living in North Carolina had soared lately. I had grown so used to looking at every single act of kindness through a lens of deep suspicion. I found myself wondering, with every greeting I received, exactly how many dollars that hello was going to cost me this time. But Emma did not stop coming by. She did not call me on the phone, and she did not scream or demand my attention. Instead, she just showed up in silence, a quiet presence that made an old school teacher like me feel incredibly awkward and confused. Every single morning, when I opened my front door to pick up the latest copy of the Charlotte Observer, I would find something small and humble waiting for me on the welcome mat. On Monday morning, it was a single sunflower that had already begun to wilt, likely plucked in a hurry from Kyle's backyard. By Wednesday, it was a smooth river stone that had been clumsily painted with a purple heart using markers, which I knew was my favorite color. I spent a long time standing there, watching the security camera footage on my tablet. I watched Emma's tiny, fleeting figure as she ran back to the car after placing her gift down, never once lingering to ask for a favor or a reward. A strange sense of irritation started to crawl under my skin. I wondered why they were using a child as such a sophisticated lure. I was certain Kyle had coached her, telling her that if she could just make her grandmother feel emotional enough, I would finally give in and hand over the money they wanted. I picked up the painted stone, fully intending to toss it into the trash, but my hands were shaking so much that I found myself tucking it into the pocket of my Skechers jacket instead. By Friday afternoon, the tension finally boiled over when I saw Emma's small shadow lingering near my mailbox again. I could not take it anymore. I threw the door wide open and marched out onto the porch, wearing the most stern and serious face I could possibly manage. Emma jumped, startled by my sudden appearance, and I noticed her pink hair bow was sitting slightly crooked on her head. I told her to stop it immediately, trying to keep my voice sharp and firm, like I was back in my old classroom. I demanded to know if her father had told her to do this. I asked her if he had sent her with these gifts just to make me feel guilty, so that I would finally sign that financial power of attorney paper for him. The little girl just looked up at me, her clear blue eyes slowly filling with tears that began to spill over. She did not try to make an excuse, and she did not talk back. She just stood there, under the fading North Carolina sun, her tiny shoulders beginning to shake with quiet sobs. Emma began to sniffle, her voice coming out in broken, jagged pieces as she told me that was not it at all. She told me that her daddy had said I was very poor now, and that I did not have enough money to even buy a turkey for dinner anymore, which was why I was so angry all the time. She said she had been saving all the money in her piggy bank just so she could buy me some apples. She told me that her father did not even know she was coming over here. She just wanted me to be happy, and she did not want me to have to sit alone in the dark anymore. She reached out her small hand and offered me a plastic bag of red apples, the cheapest kind you can find at Walmart, which she must have carefully gathered every spare penny to buy. I felt completely frozen. The sharp accusations I had been ready to scream out just vanished from my throat, replaced by a bitter and heavy sense of shame. I realized I had used my own wall of suspicion to attack a 7-year-old child, all because I was so terrified of the cruel adults in my life. I looked down at the bag of apples in Emma's hand, and then back at my house, which I had kept so tightly locked and shuttered. For the first time in many months, I realized that the fortress I had built was not actually protecting me. It was just keeping me a prisoner in my own bitterness. I did not invite her inside because the fear was still there, sitting deep and heavy in my chest. But I reached out and gently touched her shoulder. I told her that I would take the apples, and I thanked her. As she gave me a small, watery smile and ran back toward the street, I stood there on the porch and watched until her car disappeared behind the oak trees. I went back inside and placed that bag of apples right in the center of my dining table, the table that usually only saw lonely, silent dinners. The wall inside of me did not come crashing down all at once, but a visible crack had finally appeared in the stone. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, there was still a kind of love in this world that did not come with an invoice attached. Emma's small bag of apples still sat there on the cold granite kitchen counter. I spent most of the evening just staring at it. Part of me wanted to grab the bag and toss it straight into the trash to erase every trace of my own weakness. But the soft, natural scent of those cheap red apples kept drifting through the air. It reminded me of a time when our family was simple but warm. Finally, I chose the best-looking one, washed it carefully, and took a bite. The tart, sweet juice spread across my tongue, and strangely, it made the bridge of my nose sting with unshed tears. The wall I had built so high to keep out Kyle's cruelty and Brenna's neglect suddenly didn't feel tall enough to block out the simple kindness of a child. I found myself remembering autumns in North Carolina years ago, when Brenna was just a little girl. We used to drive out to the local orchards to pick apples ourselves. Back then, I was a young, energetic teacher, and my husband was still by my side. We weren't wealthy, but I never once felt poor in the way Kyle describes me now. I wondered when exactly a person's worth started being measured by a credit card balance or the brand of a cashmere sweater. The quiet success of the online business I had built in secret suddenly felt meaningless if I couldn't even use it to protect Emma's smile. But I also knew the truth. The moment I let a single detail about my actual wealth slip, Kyle would be on me like a vulture. The sharp ring of the telephone cut through my thoughts. It was Brenna. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice as steady as possible when I answered. On the other end, I heard that familiar, rhythmic sobbing, the very weapon my daughter always used whenever she was in trouble. She told me that Kyle had lost his job again. She said the landlord had just sent an eviction notice, and they would be kicked out by Friday if they didn't pay the rent. Her voice rose as she said she didn't know what to do, and that Emma and Jake might have to sleep in the truck. My heart twisted in my chest. A surge of anger flared up, not at Brina herself, but at the way she was using those children as emotional hostages to force my hand. This was exactly the kind of manipulation I had been dreading. I told her again that I was living on my small pension, a lie that made my heart pound with guilt, even as I tried to protect myself. I asked her why Kyle didn't sell that expensive truck, or use the money he spent on luxury clothes to pay their housing. Brina screamed into the phone, asking how I could be so cruel. She told me I was sitting there in my warm, comfortable house, while my own grandchildren were about to be on the street. She said Kyle was right, and that I didn't care about anyone but myself. The line went dead, with a series of cold mechanical beeps. I sank into my chair, the half-eaten apple falling from my hand. The crack in my spirit had become a deep, dark trench. I no longer felt safe in my fortress. I felt like a criminal, even though I was the one being used. After Brina's tearful phone call and those biting accusations, I could not find a moment of peace. I paced back and forth in my living room in Charlotte, my hands gripped so tightly together that my knuckles turned a stark bone white. I kept glancing out the window at the North Carolina sky, which had turned a bruised and heavy gray, signaling a thunderstorm was about to break over the city. An overwhelming sense of dread wrapped around me like a coat that was far too tight, suffocating my breath. And then, the very thing I feared most finally arrived. I heard the sharp screech of tires on my gravel driveway, followed by the violent, echoing slam of a car door, the unmistakable sound of Kyle's temper when he felt the world was not bowing to his will. My fortress was under siege. The banging on the door began almost immediately, a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds that were far too aggressive to be a simple knock. It was not the gentle, hesitant tapping I had heard from little Emma. These were direct strikes against the solid oak wood, meant to intimidate and demand entry. I stood in the hallway, my heart fluttering in my chest like a trapped bird, frantic and desperate. Through the decorative glass panel, I could see Kyle's face, flushed a deep, angry red. The expensive cashmere sweater he loved to flaunt was wrinkled and messy, a sign of his unraveling life. Beside him stood Brina, her eyes swollen and red from crying, her hand gripping young Jake's arm as the boy whimpered in confusion. They had not come to check on me or to offer love. They had brought their desperation and their aggression to force me into a corner. My hands shook as I turned the deadbolts, and the moment the door swung open, a surge of cold, tense air flooded into my home like a dark tide. Kyle did not even bother with a greeting. He marched straight into my kitchen, his heavy boots echoing on the floor, and threw a thick stack of papers onto my granite table. It was an eviction notice from their property management company, the bold red letters practically screaming off the page. Kyle hovered over me, his voice trembling with a terrifying kind of rage, accusing me of being the reason his family was suffering. He demanded to know how I could sit there with my pension and my paid-off house while I let my own daughter and grandchildren face the street. He asked if I planned to take all my money to the grave with me. Brina just stood there, leaning against the counter, offering no defense for me. Instead, she looked at me with a cold, blaming stare, as if I were the one who had failed to pay their rent. She began a long, rehearsed speech about how Kyle's job loss was just bad luck and the fault of a failing economy, never once mentioning that he had been fired for his own arrogance and refusal to follow orders. I looked into Brenna's eyes, searching for even a flicker of the little girl I had raised, but I found only a hollow, calculating emptiness. She told me she had a solution, her voice suddenly turning into a sweet, sickening crawl. She said I just needed to sign a single document for a reverse mortgage on my home. She claimed they would take out the loan in their names, and I could stay right where I was, but they would finally have the capital to pay their debts and invest in a new business. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized the depth of their betrayal. They did not just want my savings. They wanted to strip away the only sanctuary I had left in this world. They wanted to turn me into a dependent, a guest in my own home, who would be entirely at the mercy of their pity, a pity that I knew had run dry a long time ago. In that moment, something inside of me finally snapped. It was not fear that took hold, but a cold, sharp, and perfectly clear anger. I looked directly at Kyle, who was currently helping himself to a glass of water from my fridge, as if he already owned the place. I shouted for them to stop, using the same commanding voice I had used for 30 years to quiet the most difficult students in my classroom. The room fell into a sudden, shocked silence. I told Kyle that he owed tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt for luxuries he did not need, and I told Brenna that she had sat by and watched her husband insult me on Christmas night without saying a word. I asked them if they truly expected me to sacrifice my entire life and my home for their laziness and their vanity. I pointed through the window at his shiny Ford F-150 parked in my driveway and asked why he had not sold it, or why he refused to take a job at an Amazon warehouse or drive for Uber to feed his children. I asked if they really thought I should lose everything just so they could keep up appearances. Kyle let out a harsh, mocking laugh, his face twisting with pure contempt. He called me a failure and a delusional old woman who spent her days with worthless yarn. He told me that I had nothing, and that without them, I would die alone in this house, and no one would even notice for weeks. Those words were meant to break me, but instead, they acted like a catalyst, hardening my resolve into something unbreakable. I walked to the front door and threw it wide open to the cold, rainy afternoon. I told them to get out of my house immediately, and that they would never see a single cent from this property, or from me, until they learned the meaning of respect. I saw Brenna go pale with shock, and Kyle was so enraged that his fists were shaking. But I did not take a single step back. I stood tall, wrapped in the dignity of a woman who had worked her entire life, and I refused to kneel before their threats. As their truck roared away, the tires spinning and throwing gravel into the air through the white sheets of rain, I slammed the door and locked every single bolt. I sank down onto the hallway floor, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My entire body was trembling, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I felt utterly exhausted, as if I had just survived a physical battle for my very life. The house returned to silence, but it was a heavy, somber kind of quiet this time. I looked at the bag of apples Emma had left on the table, looking so small and out of place next to the pile of debt papers they had abandoned. I knew that from this moment on, a permanent line had been drawn in the sand. I was no longer the easy target they could manipulate with guilt. I am Margaret Thompson, and I will protect my independence and my peace until the very end, even if the price is a loneliness that reaches down into my very bones. After Kyle's truck disappeared into the thick North Carolina rain, I stayed there on the floor, perfectly still. The sound of the downpour hitting the roof sounded like a lonely audience witnessing the slow collapse of a family. I felt a hollow, terrifying kind of emptiness in my chest. But then, through the rumble of the thunder, I heard a different sound at the door. It wasn't the violent pounding Kyle had brought. It was 3 gentle, patient knocks. I forced myself up and wiped away the last of my tears, looking through the glass. It was Mrs. Gable, my neighbor from across the street, standing there with her umbrella tilted and a small wicker basket in her hand. I opened the door, and while the cold air rushed in, Mrs. Gable's smile was warmer than any fireplace. She told me she saw the kids leave in such a hurry and thought I might need something warm to hold on to. She placed a container of steaming chicken noodle soup and a bag of homemade cornbread into my hands. She told me to eat and not let a hungry stomach make my heart even colder. We sat together in the kitchen, a space that only minutes ago had been thick with the smell of greed and rage, but was now filled with a simple, pure scent of care. Mrs. Gable didn't ask about the fight. She just talked to me about the roses she had been pruning in her garden and how the price of gas at the Shell station down the street had gone up again. As the warmth from the soup started to seep into my body, I finally felt brave enough to look at her. I asked her if she ever felt like a bad mother for saying no to her own children. Mrs. Gable paused, putting her tea down, and her eyes grew deep and thoughtful. She told me that years ago, her own son had wanted her to mortgage her home to save his failing brokerage firm. She had refused, and he didn't speak to her for 2 long years. She took my hand in hers, and her skin was wrinkled, but her grip was full of a quiet strength. She told me that loving our children doesn't mean letting them pull us down into the abyss with them. She said, if we don't stay standing, there will be no one left to reach out and catch them when they truly fall. Her words felt like a healing medicine for my bleeding soul. I realized that for a long time, I had been blaming myself for my own financial success while my children struggled. I had let that guilt turn me into a victim. But Mrs. Gable was right. My independence was the very last foundation this family had left. If I let Kyle and Brina take my home and my savings, the whole family would truly fall apart. I took a deep breath and felt my resolve returning. I no longer saw myself as a lonely, abandoned old woman, but as a woman who was protecting what was right. When Mrs. Gable left, she didn't just leave me with soup. She left me with a renewed faith in human kindness. I went upstairs and opened my laptop, the tool I had used to build my online education empire over all these years. I looked at the revenue for today, and I saw the numbers climbing steadily. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to hide it as if it were a sin. I knew I would use it, but not to feed Kyle's laziness. I would use it to build a secure future for Emma and Jake, the ones who actually deserved unconditional love. The North Carolina streetlights reflected off my window, chasing away the ghosts of the afternoon's argument. I began to type the very first words of a new course called How to Build Boundaries to Protect Love. Sometimes, the person who brings us warmth isn't someone related by blood, but a neighbor with a simple pot of chicken soup. Have you ever received miraculous comfort from a stranger at your most desperate moment? Share your story or perspective below. After Mrs. Gable left, her chicken noodle soup was still warm on the kitchen table, but my heart had shifted into a different state, a terrifying cold clarity. Her words about standing firm to save my family kept spinning in my mind, a mantra for the battle I knew was coming. I looked at the pile of debt papers Kyle had thrown at me earlier, but then my eyes caught something else. He had left in such a hurry, consumed by his own rage, that he had forgotten a small leather briefcase tucked under the edge of the sofa. I looked at that bag, a luxury coach item he used to carry with such unearned pride, and felt a sudden, powerful urge to look inside. I was no longer just the grieving, isolated mother they wanted me to be. I was Margaret, a woman who had built a successful business from nothing, and I knew exactly how to read the truth hidden in numbers. I opened the briefcase, and what I found inside was not a collection of resumes or future business plans, as he had always claimed. Instead, it was a thick, disorganized stack of past due notices that made my breath catch in my throat. I began to flip through them, page by page, and the scale of the disaster was staggering. There were overdue balances from Chase, Citibank, and Wells Fargo, totaling nearly 6 figures in high-interest debt. As I looked closer at the itemized statements, I realized these were not expenses for the kids' needs or basic utilities. These were hundreds of charges from the high-end boutiques at South Park Mall, receipts from the most expensive steakhouses in Charlotte, and transaction after transaction for online gambling sites. Kyle was not a victim of a struggling economy or a bad break. He was a prideful addict who was systematically burning through my daughter's future to maintain a lie. I found a small, crumpled receipt tucked into a side pocket of the bag. It was dated December 23rd, just 2 days before that terrible Christmas dinner where he had mocked me. It showed that Kyle had purchased the very cashmere sweater he was wearing that night for $512, including tax. But the most sickening part was the name on the receipt. He had used a credit card in Brenna's name, the specific account I knew she had opened years ago to serve as a college fund for Emma and Jake. He had stolen the children's future just to buy a piece of clothing so he could stand in my living room and call me poor. A wave of pure disgust rose in my throat, feeling more bitter and colder than the North Carolina rain still hitting my windows. The most shocking discovery, however, was hidden at the bottom of the pile. It was a formal termination letter from his former financial consulting firm. Kyle had not been laid off because of corporate downsizing, as Brenna had cried to me on the phone. He had been fired for gross ethical violations after attempting to divert client funds into his own personal accounts. My heart began to pound against my ribs. Kyle was not just a lazy man. He was a predator. And I realized, with a jolt of fear, that I was his next intended target. He had known about my secret wealth for a long time, likely after catching a glimpse of a Stripe notification on my laptop during a previous visit. The entire drama of their impending eviction was a carefully constructed trap to force me into giving him legal control over my assets under the guise of investment advice. I sank down onto the floor, surrounded by the physical evidence of my family's rot. The biggest question remained: did Brenna know the truth? I found a copy of a joint bank statement where Brenna's signature was clear and bold, authorizing large withdrawals to pay off Kyle's gambling debts. My daughter was not just a victim in this story. She was a complicit partner because of her own weakness. She had chosen to stand with the man who was bleeding her family dry, choosing to lie to her own mother to protect a fake image of success. The pain of this betrayal tore through me all over again. But this time, it did not leave me paralyzed. It made me as hard and cold as forged steel. I picked up my phone, but I did not call Brina to demand an explanation. Instead, I called my lawyer, Richard. I told him it was Margaret and that I needed him to take immediate action. I instructed him to freeze every single trust fund I had established for Emma and Jake, ensuring that no one, not even their own mother, could touch a penny of that money until the children turned 18. I also asked him to begin the paperwork for a restraining order, just in case Kyle's desperation turned into something more dangerous. When I finally hung up the phone, I looked out the window. The ghost of the weak, ever-sacrificing mother I used to be was gone. I realized that to save my grandchildren and to teach my daughter a final, necessary lesson about the truth, I had to be the one to enforce justice in my own home. I gathered up all the documents and neatly filed them back into Kyle's Coach briefcase. I wasn't going to give it back to him just yet. It was going to be my primary evidence for the final confrontation that I knew was coming. I turned off the kitchen lights and walked upstairs, feeling a strange and unexpected sense of relief. It turns out that when you finally see the true face of the monster under your roof, you stop being afraid of it. I lay down in my bed, and for the first time in many weeks, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, even as the lightning continued to tear across the North Carolina sky. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was protecting the last fragments of decency left in our bloodline. After I put the phone down and ended the call with Richard, I walked over to the window. The heavy rain that had been pounding North Carolina all afternoon had finally let up, leaving only a few droplets clinging to the branches of the old oak tree in the yard. They sparkled under the yellow glow of the streetlights like tiny diamonds. The house was so quiet now that I could actually hear my own heartbeat. It was no longer the panicked, racing pulse of a victim. It was steady and slow, the rhythm of someone who had finally found her way out of the woods. I slowly climbed the stairs to the attic, the place where I kept the fragments of a life I used to cherish, before Kyle's lies and Brina's weakness had started to pull it all apart. I opened the old cedar chest, and that warm, familiar scent filled the air like a hug from the past. Right on top was the heavy wool coat that Thomas, my late husband, used to wear whenever we went for our long autumn walks in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I pressed my face into the rough fabric, desperately trying to find a trace of his scent. Thomas was a man of such integrity. He was the one who taught me that the real value of a family isn't in what we own, but in how we protect the truth and stay kind to one another. Looking at our faded wedding photo, I saw the trust in his eyes. I knew he would never want me to be treated like some old, discarded object that our children could just move around as they pleased. I sat there on the attic floor, surrounded by piles of old family albums. I flipped through the pages and saw Brina when she was just a little girl, with her hair in a ponytail, so happy with her very first bicycle. My heart felt a sharp tug of pain, thinking about how that innocent child had grown into someone who could lie to her own mother. But in the middle of that sadness, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Protecting my home and my independence wasn't about getting even or seeking revenge. It was the only way I could hold on to the values Thomas and I had spent our whole lives building together. I owed it to him, to myself, and to the future of Emma and Jake to stand for the truth. I would not let Kyle's greed turn these beautiful memories into nothing but ashes. The longest night of my life was finally coming to an end. As the very first rays of dawn started to peek through the leaves outside, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. All the doubt and the fear seemed to have been washed away with the rain. I didn't feel lonely in my fortress anymore, because I knew Thomas was still right here with me, giving me the courage I needed. I carefully packed the box back up and closed the lid with a quiet, firm click. I went downstairs, made myself a hot cup of tea, and watched the horizon turn a soft, glowing pink. I was ready. I was ready to face the truth, ready to set boundaries that could never be broken, and ready to give this family a chance to finally grow up from the ruins of their own lies. The next morning, I sat in my living room in Charlotte, North Carolina, clutching a warm cup of Earl Grey tea, my eyes fixed on the television screen, still on standby. Kyle's Coach briefcase sat on the coffee table like a ticking time bomb, waiting to go off. I had mentally prepared myself for this visit because I knew they would return. People who are desperate and drowning in debt never give up until they get what they want. At exactly 9 a.m, I heard the familiar screech of Kyle's truck in my driveway, and I felt the strength of the woman who built an empire from nothing rise up inside me. I was no longer just the forgotten school teacher they thought they could manipulate. They walked into my home with completely different faces today, not screaming, but wearing a mask of fake sadness. Kyle placed a stack of legal documents on the table, his voice turning dangerously sweet as he told me he stayed up all night thinking of a way to help. He handed me a reverse mortgage application, claiming the bank would release $200,000 immediately if I just signed. He promised they would use the money to pay off the debts and then move me into a new villa where I would never be lonely again. Brenna took my hand, her eyes filling with tears as she begged me to do it for the sake of the grandchildren, saying Emma and Jake needed a stable home. They were using my love for those children as a final bargaining chip, not knowing I could see through their lies to the very bone. I gently pulled my hand away from Brenna and pushed Kyle's briefcase toward him, telling them that before I signed anything, we needed to talk about what was inside. Kyle's face turned from a healthy pink to a ghostly white in a split second as I opened the bag and pulled out the $500 receipt for his sweater and the list of gambling transactions. I told him I knew he didn't lose his job because of the economy, but because he violated professional ethics. I confronted him with the fact that while he called me poor, he was using the children's college fund to buy designer clothes. The room fell into a deadly silence as Brenna looked at her husband and then back at me, her lips trembling as she tried to say she was only trying to help him. At that exact moment, I used the remote to turn on the television, where a local financial news segment called Impressive Startup Faces was beginning to air. My own image, Margaret Thompson, sitting in a modern office in downtown Charlotte, appeared on the screen. The announcer excitedly spoke about the woman who turned simple knitting lessons and educational skills into an online empire worth $2.5 million in just 2 years. Kyle and Brenna stood there, frozen, their eyes glued to the screen, as the world recognized the success they had mocked. The bank balance they were so hungry for was actually held by the woman they had spent months calling a poor old lady. I stood up and looked directly at them, feeling a deep sense of disappointment rather than hatred. I told them that yes, I have money, but not a single penny of it would ever be used to fund their laziness or their lies. Kyle began to stammer, his attitude changing instantly as he realized his mistake calling me mother and suggesting they could help me manage the wealth because we were family. I gave him a cold smile and told him that real family does not trick their mother into selling her home to pay off gambling debts or insult her at Christmas dinner. I looked at Brenna as she sank into a chair and told her that while I loved her, I would no longer cover for her weakness, and they would have to stand on their own feet from now on. I took the mortgage contract and ripped it into pieces right in front of them, telling them to get out of my house. I informed them that my lawyer would be in contact to set up a separate education trust for Emma and Jake that they would never be able to touch. I told them that was the only help they would receive until they learned the value of honesty and hard work. When Kyle looked like he might move toward me, I simply pointed to my security camera and told him not to test my patience. They left my house in a humiliation that was far quieter than their arrival. I sat down, feeling a new surge of power in my veins, because the truth was finally out, and I was finally free. The moment Margaret tore up the mortgage contract was the moment she reclaimed her dignity. What do you think of Margaret's actions? Was she too cruel for being wealthy, yet leaving her children to fend for themselves? Or was it the only lesson that could save their future? After the heavy oak door finally clicked shut behind Kyle and Brenna, my house in Charlotte did not feel like a cold fortress anymore. it returned to being a home, a place where every breath I took felt sweet with the taste of freedom. I spent the entire next week cleaning every corner, not just of the house, but of my life. I pulled down the heavy, dark curtains that had been shielding me from the world and let the brilliant North Carolina sunshine flood into every single room. I finally understood that setting boundaries is not about building a wall to lock the world out. It is about creating a safe space where the people who truly love you can finally walk into. I began to start my mornings not with a heavy sense of dread, but with a clear and methodical plan for the next beautiful chapter of my life. The first thing I did was sit down with my lawyer, Richard, to finish setting up the education trust for Emma and Jake. I made a very firm decision not to give any of that money directly to Brina or Kyle. Instead, I arranged to pay for their tuition, their sports fees, and their extra tutoring classes directly through the school systems. One warm Saturday afternoon, I invited Emma over to the house. This time, Kyle was nowhere to be seen. We sat together on the back porch, the sun warming our shoulders, as we worked on some small knitted toys for her room. Emma looked up at me with her big, curious eyes and asked if I really was not poor after all. I just smiled at her, gently stroking her hair, and told her that I was rich because I had the value of hard work and because I had her. I told her that money was just a tool to protect the things that truly matter in life. Seeing her laugh and play made me realize that this was exactly how I would teach her the value of integrity and labor, the very things her father had lost somewhere along the way. My online education business continued to grow at a pace I never expected after that news segment aired. But my mission had shifted into something much deeper. Instead of just teaching the technical skills of knitting, I began to weave lessons on financial management for older women and how to build healthy family boundaries into my courses. I started receiving thousands of emails from women all across America. Women who were also being belittled, ignored, or manipulated by their own children. I realized that my purpose was much bigger than just making a profit. It was about using my own painful story to give them back the power they felt they had lost. I even hired Mrs. Gable to be my community assistant, helping me respond to all the heartfelt letters we received. Every morning, the two of us sit by our computers with the windows open, sipping chamomile tea and planting seeds of hope for strangers from New York all the way to California. I still keep a necessary distance from Brina, though my heart still aches for her more than I can say. I know she is facing the harsh reality of her choices now that Kyle was forced to sell his expensive truck just to pay off a small fraction of their mountain of debt. I do not step in to save her from the consequences, even when every motherly instinct in me wants to reach out and fix it. I simply sent her a book about escaping emotional dependency, along with a short, honest note, telling her I would be right here whenever she was finally ready to be honest with herself. I noticed recently that she has enrolled in an accounting course at the local community college. It is a small signal, a tiny green sprout trying to push through the cold ashes of all those lies they told. I do not expect everything to change in a single day, but I have a quiet faith in the natural law that we eventually reap exactly what we sow. This past weekend, I treated myself to a short trip up to the Blue Ridge Mountains. I drove my reliable Subaru through the winding mountain roads, breathing in the crisp, clean air of the forest. I sat by a rushing stream for hours, reading a book and feeling Thomas's presence right there beside me in the silence. I realized I do not need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I am a millionaire, yes, but more importantly, I am a woman with the power of choice, with her dignity fully intact, and with a heart that has finally begun to heal. My footsteps feel light and certain now, as I walk toward the light of a future where I am the only one holding the key to the door. The peace I had spent so many weeks carefully cultivating was shattered in an instant by the sharp, persistent ringing of my telephone in the dead of night. In the heavy darkness of my bedroom, the light from the screen flickered against the walls like a frantic warning signal. I saw Brina's name on the caller ID, and my heart tightened with a primal fear that overrode every financial boundary and emotional wall I had spent months building. When I answered, it wasn't my daughter's voice on the other end. Instead, I heard the chaotic siren of an ambulance and the hurried, professional tone of a paramedic from Atrium Health here in Charlotte. They told me Brina had been involved in a serious industrial accident at the warehouse where she had recently started working. In that single moment, all the anger I felt and all the secrets about my million-dollar business became completely secondary. All I knew was that my child was hurting and she needed me. When I arrived at the emergency room, the air was thick with a sharp scent of antiseptic and the constant rhythmic beeping of medical monitors. I spotted Kyle sitting in the waiting area, but he didn't look like a man who was praying for his wife's life. He was hunched over his phone, pacing in a small circle while talking to someone in a hushed but urgent tone. I moved closer, staying in the shadows, and heard him discussing the accident, not as a tragedy, but as a potential windfall. He was asking if they could sue the warehouse for a 6-figure settlement because she was injured on the clock. A wave of pure nausea rolled over me. Even as his wife lay between life and death, his first instinct was to turn her pain into a financial move. I walked up and stood directly in front of him, my shadow falling over his face. I didn't say a single word, but the coldness in my eyes was enough to make him stumble over his words and slowly lower his phone. Kyle immediately tried to change his demeanor when he realized I was there, squeezing out a few forced tears and reaching for my arm. He told me that Brenna needed emergency surgery, but their insurance had been canceled because they were so far behind on the premiums. He claimed the hospital was demanding a massive deposit right now before they could proceed. He looked me in the eye and told me that as a millionaire, I had to save her, because this was when family mattered most. He held out his hand, not asking for help, but demanding it, based on the guilt he thought I still carried as a mother. He was banking on my panic, hoping I would be too distracted to notice. He wanted me to hand the money directly to him to manage the medical expenses. But he had no idea that the Margaret who stood before him was no longer the woman he had mocked at Christmas. I reached into my purse and pulled out my black credit card, walking straight past him to the billing desk. I introduced myself as Margaret Thompson, Brenna's mother, and told the administrator I would be personally responsible for every cent of the treatment, and that I wanted the best surgical team in Charlotte assigned to her case. I turned back to look at Kyle while the hospital staff processed the paperwork, and told them very clearly that every single bill and every medical decision would go directly through me and my lawyer. I made it plain that not one penny would ever touch his personal bank account or Brenna's. I told him I would save my daughter's life, but I was done funding his laziness and his predatory schemes for even one more second. Kyle stood there frozen as he realized the financial bait he had been waiting for was now locked behind a legal wall he could never break through. The next morning, when Brenna finally drifted awake after her surgery, I sat by her bed and held her thin, pale hand, which was covered in IV lines. I didn't lead with accusations. Instead, I played back a recording I had secretly made of Kyle's phone call in the hallway the night before. I watched her face as she heard her husband's voice calculating how much money they could get from her injury while she was still unconscious in the ER. The room was deathly quiet as the recording ended. and Brenna closed her eyes, while tears began to carve tracks through the hospital pallor on her cheeks. The truth was far more painful than the physical trauma she had endured. She realized that the man she had sacrificed her relationship with me to protect saw her as nothing more than a tool for a payout. She whispered an apology to me, her voice hoarse with a deep, gut-wrenching regret. I brushed her hair back from her forehead, but I kept my voice firm and serious. I told her that I would take care of her recovery, and I would make sure Emma and Jake had everything they needed for a bright future. But I also told her that I would not pay off Kyle's credit card debts, and I would not let her continue to live a life built on a foundation of his lies. I told her that once she left this hospital, she would have to make a choice. She could finally stand up and take control of her own life, or she could continue to sink into the dark with him. I explained that while I had millions of dollars, I would never use it to buy her a fake life. I told her I would use my resources to buy her a real opportunity to grow up and be the mother her children deserved. This wasn't a punishment. It was the hardest, truest love I had ever offered her. A few hours later, Kyle burst into the room, trying to reclaim his dominance by shouting about how I had no right to interfere in his marriage. I stood up and pulled a thick folder from my bag that Richard had prepared for me. I told him I had evidence of all the gambling debts he had hidden in Brenna's name, and proof that he had intentionally misled me about his job loss to manipulate my finances. I gave him a final ultimatum. He could sign the voluntary divorce papers and leave Charlotte immediately, or I would file a formal criminal complaint against him for elder financial abuse and fraud. I told him he could choose a quiet exit with a small settlement to relocate, or he could face a jury and spend years in a prison cell. My absolute calm terrified him. He looked to Brenna for support, but for the first time in their marriage, she turned her face away and refused to look at him. As Kyle finally walked away, carrying the heavy shame of a man who had lost his last hand of poker, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. The hospital room seemed to fill with a new, bright light. Brenna looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't calculation or shame. It was a deep, sincere respect and a flickering spark of hope. She told me she wanted to go back to school and become the kind of mother that Emma could finally be proud of. I smiled at her, a real smile that reached all the way to my heart. We still have a very long road of healing ahead of us, but the foundation has been reset. It isn't built on my money, but on the truth and a newfound sense of self-respect. My fortress is open now, not for invaders, but for the family that has finally found their way home through the storm. 6 months have passed since that stormy night at the hospital. Summer in North Carolina has arrived in full bloom, bringing with it the vibrant gold of sunflower fields and the steady rhythmic hum of cicadas in the heavy branches of the oak trees. I am sitting on my back porch today, sipping a glass of cold, fresh lemonade and looking out at the garden that Mrs. Gable and I spent all spring planting together. This house is no longer a cold fortress meant to keep people out. It has become an open space where the warmth of the truth and sincere love can finally breathe. I no longer feel the need to hide in the shadows of my own suspicion, because I know in my heart that I have protected the things that were truly worth saving. Brenna just stopped by a few minutes ago, and she looks more radiant than I have seen her in years, wearing the simple uniform of a junior accounting assistant. Kyle finally signed the divorce papers and moved away to Texas to try and start over on his own, which was a fair price for the path he chose to walk. I did not help him with money, but I allowed him to leave with the last bit of respect he had left. Brenna is driving a reliable used car now, one she pays for herself, and she is managing her own small bills. Most importantly, she has found her self-respect again. Emma is currently running across the green grass, waving a math test where she earned a perfect A. Watching my daughter and grandchildren grow strong through these difficult times has taught me that tough love was the greatest gift I could have ever offered them. My wealth is no longer a heavy secret or a burden. It is the energy I use to nurture their real dreams. This is Casey, and listening to Margaret's journey has moved me deeply. We are so often taught that family love must be unconditional and silent. But sometimes, the most powerful lesson we can ever teach is how to say no to protect the values that matter. Margaret did not choose revenge. She chose to set a steel boundary. She used her success not to control her family, but to finally free them from the cycle of lies and laziness. To all the women listening, especially those who find themselves in Margaret's shoes, your dignity does not depend on the size of your 401k. It depends on your courage to stand up for the truth. Never let anyone turn your sacrifice into something they are simply entitled to. And never fear the silence of being alone when you are choosing the path of integrity. There is always a beautiful light waiting at the end of the road for those who are brave enough to walk it on their own 2 feet. The story of Margaret Thompson ends here, but the journey for each of us continues. How do you feel about Margaret's rebirth? Is there a specific part of her message that stayed with you today? Would you be brave enough to set a boundary like she did if you were in her place? Please share your thoughts and your heart in the comments below. I am always here to listen and to help you heal. Thank you so much for listening.